Hey guys! All right, we're going to continue on with lecture. So I've noticed that not all of you are actually watching the lecture. So there might be some things in this lecture that aren't necessarily in the textbook. So make sure you're paying attention and taking notes. So after World War I, things became very different in Europe. So there was less democracy and we see a rise of dictators. Now, in order to get into power, these dictators would promise peace and stability. But as we see moving through the rest of the school year, we're going to see that these dictators were not able to deliver on their promises. So the dictators promised peace and stability, but that's not what happened. Dictators promised peace and stability, but that's not what happened. All right, so the first country we're going to take some time looking at is Russia. So Russia and the rise of the Soviet Union. In Russia, the Social Democratic Party split into two different groups, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. You're going to need to know these two parties and what they both supported. So let's start with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were radical, they supported violence, and they were a smaller group, but they controlled the country for 70 years. So 3 things to write about the Bolsheviks. 1, they were more radical. 2, they supported violence. And 3, they were smaller, but they controlled the country for 70 years. All right, pause and rewind if you need to finish writing that down. Now let's talk about the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks are the opposite, basically. They wanted peace and to bring change peacefully. They were a more moderate group, and their name actually means minority party, but they were actually the larger group of people in Russia. So your 3 things to write about the Mensheviks. First, peaceful change. Second, more moderate, larger group in Russia. First, bring peaceful change, more moderate, and they were the larger group. All right, so in the middle of World War I, Tsar Nicholas stepped down because the Russians were losing the war. And at that point in time, the Mensheviks, the larger group of people in Russia, took over. But the Bolsheviks stirred up the Russian workers and the Mensheviks were eventually overthrown. And that is when Vladimir Lenin came on the scene. So Vladimir Lenin had been exiled to Germany while Tsar Nicholas was in charge of Russia. But he got the German government to let him return to Russia, and then because the Germans helped Vladimir Lenin rise to power, he signed the treaty with Germany that took Russia out of the war. So if you remember from the last chapter, or the last section, we talked about how the Russians actually exited the war like right in the middle of it. This is why. Vladimir Lenin got put into power, and then because of that, he took Russia out of the war. Vladimir Lenin became the first dictator of Russia. Vladimir Lenin, first dictator. Vladimir Lenin, Russia's first dictator. Now, Lenin was a Marxist, which basically means he was a communist, but he didn't do everything exactly the way that Karl Marx would have liked. So a few things that Karl Marx would not have liked that Lenin did was, first of all, Lenin promoted violence over peace. So Lenin wanted violence, and he felt like there needed to be violence in order to cause the revolution to happen. Second, he thought that there needed to be strong leadership himself and not spontaneous revolts. And third, he wanted a small, elite group of people to rule instead of a dictatorship of the masses. So if you think about it, basically Lenin wanted an oligarchy. The major thing that Lenin did agree with Marx about was religion. And he used force whenever pastors and priests stood up against him. So Lenin did not support religion. Lenin was against religion, basically. So Lenin was against religion. After Lenin died, Joseph Stalin became the second dictator of Russia. Joseph Stalin became the second dictator of Russia. Stalin, second dictator. And Stalin remained in power until well after World War II. So Lenin died, Stalin took over, and he built up industrial production in Russia. He brought agriculture, so basically farming, under control of the central government. He crushed rebellion, and he destroyed the homes of and executed pastors and priests. So before Lenin died, he actually wrote a pamphlet which he kind of denounced Joseph Stalin and said that he should be removed from power, but that didn't happen, and Stalin was in power until 1953. So he was around for a long time. All right, our next country that we need to talk about is Germany. And in Germany, we're going to see the rise of the Nazi Party. At the end of World War I, the Germans created a republic, and it was called the Weimar Republic. But it didn't work out because there were too many different political parties in Germany, and so it was too hard for one political party to rise up and become powerful. So the Weimar Republic was the first government in Germany after World War I, and it was not successful. Weimar Republic, first government in Germany after World War I. Then in 1933, we see the rise of the Nazi Party. And who was the leader of the Nazi Party? You may ask. Well, I think you all know the answer, and that's Adolf Hitler. So the Nazi Party actually stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And once Adolf Hitler rose into power, he declared himself dictator of Germany and used fascism to rebuild Germany. We're going to discuss fascism in just one second, but before we do, I want to let you guys know that Adolf Hitler didn't do anything sneaky or cheating to get into power. He rose to power through the natural rise of government. So we have to be careful about who we're electing into political office because we never know what might end up happening with them and how they might try to steal power like Adolf Hitler ended up doing. So I want you guys to look at page 318. There's a little purple box and it talks about the basic principles of fascism. It's very important that you understand fascism. So in 6th grade, we learned about a monarchy, we learned about democracy, we learned about a republic, we learned about an oligarchy. So those were the 4 kinds of government we learned about in 6th grade. Now you need to add fascism and communism to that list as well as different kinds of governments that exist in the world. So looking at that page, fascism is where businesses are privately owned but tightly controlled by the government. So you can own your own business, but the government is going to cause a lot of regulation and they're going to try and control what happens with your business. 2, fascists place an extreme emphasis on nationalism and glorify the state, which means under a fascist type of government, it's going to be very patriotic. Everyone's going to want to support their country and yay, go us kind of a thing. And 3rd, dictators are going to be supported by the military and in a fascist state. So in order for the fascist dictator to keep his power, he's going to use the military to do that. And so that's what we see happening in Germany and also in Italy. So Germany turned to fascism, Italy turned to fascism, and we're going to see in a couple slides, Japan also turned to fascism. But let's focus on Italy next. So in World War I, Italy had lost 500,000 men, and the war had destroyed their economy. The people wanted a strong leader who would restore their national pride and make them a strong country again. So they elected Benito Mussolini he formed the fascist party and then got the king to appoint him as the leader of Italy, and eventually Benito Mussolini became the dictator of Italy. As you can see, there's a lot of people in this section, so you're gonna wanna make sure that you know what each of these people did because they're gonna be important as we move through the rest of the school year. All right, so in order to help Italy economically, he built up the economy so that it became self-sufficient. He organized the workforce, he monitored the economy, he controlled wages and prices, and to make himself seem more legit, he created the Lateran treaties with the Pope, and that created Vatican City. So in order to keep the Catholics happy, he made this treaty. So there you go, the Lateran treaty with the Pope and creating Vatican City with that. Remember, World War I was supposed to be the war that ends all wars. So after the war, there was a lot of work done to try and create long-term peace in the world. The first thing that was created was the League of Nations. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, worked to create the League of Nations, but the United States Senate wouldn't allow the United States to join the League of Nations because the Senate was afraid that was going to lead to the United States becoming less powerful, basically. So the League of Nations, created by President Woodrow Wilson, but the United States did not join, and that probably led to the League of Nations falling apart eventually. Next, we have the Washington Naval Conference. So there are 3 other pacts or agreements that were created in an attempt to promote peace. And the first one is the Washington Naval Conference. That was created in Washington, D.C., and it limited the number of ships that each nation could build. Make sure you're making notes about all of these 3 pacts that are coming next. So the Washington Naval Conference limited the number of ships for the Navy that each nation could build. Then we have the Locarno Pact. The Locarno Pact was between Germany, France, and Belgium, and it established each of those 3 countries' boundaries as being permanent. But Germany violated it right at the beginning, and that's basically what started World War II because Germany wanted to expand its size, and if it had stuck by the Locarno Pact, World War II couldn't have happened. But it did. The last pact was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that was an agreement to settle all disputes by negotiation, not force. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact settle disputes by negotiation rather than by force. All right, so a little interesting fact about me that you might want to write down. I love Washington, D.C., which is where the Washington Naval Conference was created. So go ahead and write that down. Miss Peralta loves to visit Washington, D.C. Miss Peralta loves visiting Washington, D.C. All right, sorry that this slide is a little funky, but we're going to continue talking about shifts in the post-World War, and we're moving into talk about China. So the problem at the beginning of this time period was that the Qing dynasty in China was failing and there needed to be a new government. So Sun Yat-sen rose to power and he led a group of military officers, students, and they were working to bring reform. And he created the Kuomintang Party. But this was not a successful movement because the prime minister in China worked against the Kuomintang Party and Sun Yat-sen, and so he could never bring unity. So Sun Yat-sen tried to bring unity by creating the Kuomintang Party. After Sun Yat-sen died, Chiang Kai-shek took over, and he realized that the way that the Russians were doing communism in Russia wasn't going to work in China. And so then he worked to fight against bringing communism to China. But eventually Mao Zedong did bring communism to China. But it took a little while for communism to start in China because, first of all, China was involved in a civil war. Then Japan attacked China, so China had to stop fighting each other, which is what a civil war is, and start fighting the common enemy, Japan. And then World War II happened, and then after World War II was over, then communism was able to finally start up in China. All right, this is our last slide, and we're going to talk about what happened in Japan. So in Japan, we see a rise of militarism, and that's because the military was growing very powerful, and Japan was trying to create an overseas empire. And Japan, so they were a military state, and they used fascism, just like Germany and Italy had used to increase their economy. So they had a strong military, they had a strong economy, and they wanted to conquer other nations. And that's kind of what led them into World War II. Last, we have the Middle East and the rise of Pan-Arabianism. So basically, this was when the Arabs were trying to work together to create a unified section of the world. It didn't really work out until well after World War II, and then there still is no real unified Arab group of people. So that's where we're going to leave things off for today. Make sure you took notes, and good luck on your quiz at the end of the week.